Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion on Muslimistan, exploring Islam in post-uprising Bangladesh and beyond. This event is organized by Shancharan.com, which is an online platform dedicated to promoting Islamicate thought among the Bengali speaking audiences. First of all, I would like to start this program by expressing my utmost respect and prayers for all the martyrs during the July and August uprising in Bangladesh. So according to the official estimate, we know so far that more than 800 people were martyred and like thousands of people have been injured. Our prayers are with them. So this historic movement in Bangladesh has shaken a lot of our understanding with regards to relationship between Islam and the state, Islam and politics, what would be the role of Islam in the public sphere, etc. The reason we have chosen part of the title is beyond is because we don't want to see what happened in Bangladesh just in terms of a quest for justice within a particular national border. Rather than there are lots of categories like Islam, like identity, and other things which has connections globally speaking. And in an age of where in academic studies, studying global interconnected affairs has become a fashion, a trend, we want to locate the event, the July incident in Bangladesh, in that very global interconnected context. So we will, today in our discussion, we will mainly focus on, first of all, with a kind of reflection on the question of Islam, how our esteemed scholars are problematizing and trying to frame it and trying to analyze all these categories. And after that, we will move on to discuss issues like 47, the Pakistan, the idea of Pakistan, and subsequently what happened in 1971. Moving forward, we will engage topic like Islamism and Islam, and what kind of reflection we can see on the state level and the social level in Bangladesh. So I will first start. So instead of introducing all our esteemed speakers one by one, it will take quite a long time. What I will do, I will first ask each of you to share your own reflection on the recent affairs of Bangladesh in connection with Islam. And while doing that, I will introduce yourself briefly. So let me first start with Brother Tanzeen Doha. Tanzeen Doha Bhai. Since Tanzeen Doha is more familiar with the events in Bangladesh, let me first introduce him first. He is a visiting assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh. He's an anthropologist of Islamism, secularism, and race. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Davis, with a designated emphasis in critical theory. In 2021 to 23, he did a postdoctoral fellowship at Cornell University. His first book project, an ethnographic study of the effective and ethical life world of Muslims of varying political and spiritual commitments, traces how Islamic practitioners of the Deobandi tradition became ethically suspicious of the sovereign powers of the state in the aftermath of the 2013 Shapla massacre in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So he's particularly interested in 20th century Islamist thought in terms of their political moral actions and psycho-existential conditions. So Tanzeen Bhai, I'd like to first have your thought on how you are framing the Islam question in Bangladesh. What kind of problem it raises, what kind of question it raises in the public domain and also in the academic sphere.
Thank you, Toha. And I'd like to thank everyone, all the participants. Can everyone hear me? Okay. All right, wonderful. And I would like to thank the organizers, Sean Charon in particular. And I'll quickly say that the events of July and August is a very historically groundbreaking event. Those of us who have tried to study the situation in Bangladesh, particularly the last regime, which I would call a secular necropolitical regime, a war on terror regime, that it's at least a symbolic ending. It was not really something that we had imagined. Your question, Toha, is quite loaded. It has a lot of components to it. The question of Islam was actually foundational to this particular moment because, as you know, that the first sentence of the struggle was Ami ke tumi ke Rajakar Rajakar, which directly connects to the constitutive dimension of Bangladesh as a state and how the Bengali nationalist narrative was constructed through a particular articulation of the enemy. And so this was a very important moment to think about what the future of Bangladesh could become and what the participants, and not just the students, but the general population, what kind of imagination they had about the future. So, a lot of us who have been in conversation with the ground for many years, the Islam question was not always central. We were having many interesting conversations in various study circles, in various sort of smaller formations, but the fact that it became a national moment for that question, that even right now, as we are thinking through, there are questions about what kind of constitution we would like to see, how is it going to reflect the spirit of this struggle, and so on, that it has become a sort of national level conversation. So that is a big gift, I would say, of the movement. There are many tendencies in Bangladesh, and we can get to that as we go through other questions. But one of the things, of course, the beginning point is that this was a major struggle and a major shift in the fact that the regime is gone. But there are many things that are still there. So the face of the regime is gone. A new interim government is there. But we are kind of in Bangladesh. I know in some of our conversations, Toha, and with others, some of the very close interlocutors, we have kind of reversed Mahmoud Mamdani's framing of good Muslim, bad Muslim to talk about the seculars in Bangladesh as good and bad seculars. And we sometimes talk about how what we have gotten rid of are the bad secularists who think about the opposition, and particularly those with an Islamic orientation, as sort of like ontological enemy of the state. So we're noticing now is a kind of emergence, well, possibly of a different kind of secularism as well, which wants to discipline Muslims, which wants to, instead of directly assaulting Islamists, there is an intention. There's different types of sort of disciplinary techniques. Some of it is to convince them of a secular state, to keep bringing up a particular kind of discourse about Pakistan, and so on. So again, there's a really interesting and rich kind of conversation happening in Bangladesh, and those of us who are observing it, we're really trying to be very, very careful in thinking about how the so-called civil society in Bangladesh is now going to construct or are thinking about a new state, and who are its various associates, and of course the people, how are they responding to it? How will they respond to it? We know that there are different tendencies within Islamism, but at the same time, there is a lot of conversation about this possibility that we have currently. I would like to leave the question here, and we can talk more as the conversation progresses.
Thank you, Doha, for your insights. And yeah, some of the issues that you brought up, we will dive into a bit deeper. So now, let me introduce Professor Naveeda Khan. Professor Naveeda Khan is a chair of anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. Her doctoral and postdoctoral project was on Islam, State, and Everyday in Pakistan. She's the editor of the book Beyond Crisis, Reevaluating Pakistan, which is published in 2010. She's also the author of Muslim Becoming, Aspiration and Skepticism in Pakistan, published in 2012, which won the American Institute of Pakistan Studies Book Prize in 2013. She is also the author of Rebel Life and the Uprising of Nature. So she also the author of Rebel Life and the Uprising of Nature 2023, and also In Quest for a Shared Planet, Negotiating Climate from the Global South in the same year. So Professor Naveeda Khan, my question to you would be, you have worked on the question of Islam in Pakistan, and also it has connection in the way Islam is perceived in the aftermath of 1971 Independence War. So, as an anthropologist of Islam, how are you framing the Islam question in Bangladesh? Would you like to share some of your initial reflection on this topic?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me. And I'm very excited to be part of this conversation because it is a sort of a new inquiry for me in the context of Bangladesh. As you just pointed out, my work in Bangladesh has been quite different from my work on Pakistan. In Pakistan, I was much more centrally focused on the question of Islam and what it meant for Pakistani state and the society. Whereas in the context of Bangladesh, when I swiveled to work on a similar topic about 10 years ago, this was the time of this is a little bit after the caretaker government. And I realized that I couldn't ask the same questions in Bangladesh, that people were fundamentally uncomfortable with asking, with my questions about, what did they imagine for the state? What did they imagine for themselves, etc. And so I decided to pursue a different interest, which was much more focused on environmental issues, and rural life, or specifically life on silt islands in the Jamuna River. So that was quite a hard swivel. And so, what's really interesting to me about the moment now in Bangladesh is that some of the same issues that I had heard in the context of Pakistan are finally bubbling up here. And so I'm curious to see if that kind of inquiry that I had undertaken in Pakistan could also be done here. And that involved really looking at, what the idea of Pakistan meant for a wider Bengali populace, not just, what came about in 71, but the investment in the idea before 71, and how it is that a certain kind of Muslim society was imagined very independently of major figures of the Pakistan movement, such as Jinnah. And so that would be, I think, a very rich strain of inquiry that we could perhaps now finally have the space to revive in the present. Again, I'm thinking of it as a scholar very much, as opposed to thinking of like what the state, process of rethinking itself, or what the constitutional rethinking might be. I'm thinking more about what sorts of questions are askable in the moment, right? What sorts of questions were foreclosed or occluded, and why it is that they were, and how it is that we can revive those questions about what kinds of roots Islam has in this part, which is very deep. The specificities of the question, its global reach, its connections, all of these things, I think, become more available to us to ask about now. So maybe I'll just stop there.
Thank you for your comments. But for our, maybe as the discussion progresses, I would like to point out, I'd like to hear some of your insights about what kind of methodological challenges that you might face when you deal with the question of Islam in Bangladesh, particularly. So I will now go to Professor Salman Sayyid. Professor Salman Sayyid is a professor of social theory and decolonial thought at the University of Leeds. He specializes in decolonial thought, and among his published books are A Fundamental Fear, published in 1997, and also Recalling the Caliphate, 2014. He's also the editor of the journal Reorient. And if I am right, his upcoming book is Islamism as Philosophy, which has been long due, I think. So my question to both Salman Said is, as we have put the title of our panel discussion today, Muslimistan. So how would you put the recent events in Bangladesh in your framework of Muslimistan, and what kind of challenges and potentials you see in terms of Islam in Bangladesh?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much for your question, but thank you very much for organizing this. And I'm delighted to be in company of such interesting speakers, and I hope we have a very meaningful conversation. I think it's really, really important, and you raised this question twice about the methodological implications of how we study the Islamicate generally and specifically. And one of the issues has been that I imagine most people on this panel and most people who study the Islamicate are all kind of people who have read Orientalism and react to it. And they reacted in two ways. One, the reactor said that we read Orientalism and we'll just carry on doing what we did before we read Orientalism or before our tutors read Orientalism, but we'll just say that we read Orientalism. And the other one is to say, well, what does actually, if you take the argument of Orientalism seriously, what does it actually imply for a real life situation that has occurred now? So one of the things that we've been working on, and thank you for mentioning the journal, is this project of critical Muslim studies. And one of its elements is the idea of the necessity of abandoning methodological nationalism. And methodological nationalism simply assumes that every nation state is not only a legal entity or has a political or economic edifice, it also has an epistemological and academic edifice. So you have a cricket team, you have a flag, and you have school books and textbooks which talk about, for example, Bangladesh studies or any other studies in terms of that. And what it does is basically assume that events and processes are contained within the boundary of the nation state without actually being able to explain why that may or may not be the case for every single thing. So one of the things that we would look at is, and I think what's really important to look at, is recontextualizing the way in which the events in Bangladesh could be understood. And that would require us to move away from the kind of Orientalist framing, which would fix it either firstly as something that happens and which is specific to the nation state, and then you end up with this kind of by stealth or sometimes even more openly, this project of ethno-nationalism, which values the idea of the ethnos and the nation, which is ultimately racial constructs, as being the ones which carry the most burden of explanation. Now, we may not say this, but we actually do this in our work. And secondly, it will also be a question about thinking about area studies and thinking, well, here is something. Bangladesh is part of South Asia. South Asia has its own particularities, etc., which do not need to be explained, and they could simply be assumed. And in fact, the critique, for example, from Ronald Inden of Indonology shows some of the difficulties around that. And just to bring it up to date, one of the things that the main argument Ronald Inden made in his book on Imagining India was the idea of conceiving of South Asia in particular as essentially a Hindu space. And therefore, those who are not Hindus are considered to be intrusions, and therefore the binary becomes between Hindu and non-Hindu. And in fact, one of the things you can see being played out after the uprising again is this frontier being drawn between what is happening now to a Hindu minority and what has that got to do with the possibilities of how you can describe a new republic, for example. So having taken this into account, let me just suggest two main ways. And I'm interested you use the category of Muslimistan. And this is a useful way of thinking about things, I would argue. Let's suggest that from 1924 onwards, there have been two main political logics operating among Muslim communities throughout the world. One of them, I would argue, could be described as Kemalism, And that's not just the things that Mustafa Kemal did in Turkey, but they have been reproduced and replicated in many, many different places. So we can talk about it in terms of secularism, we can talk about it in terms of nationalism, trying to displace the Islamicate from public sphere. And that is one of those logics. And in opposition to that, well, I could argue there is something called Islamism, which again has many, many different actors and many different tendencies, but it is actually attempting to try and center whatever Islam may mean in public life. If you understand those tensions, you have the possibility of talking about describing a different kind of history, rather than a history which is specific to particular regions and countries. You can start seeing the connections and the possibilities of why these things unfold in a particular way. So if you put it like this, then you could certainly see that in Pakistan, in United Pakistan, in Bangladesh and West Pakistan, you see those kind of logics between the Kemalist projects and the Islamicist projects defining much of political struggles in there. And the actuality of this now produces a number of tensions. It allows us to see that, for example, the removal of authoritarian regime, like it happened in Egypt, like it happened in other places like Syria, Libya, etc., does not in itself mean that that moment will remain. And the reason is this, that those groupings, international and sometimes domestic, who often talk about democracy, who often talk about authoritarianism, will also, when it comes to the question of the Islamicate, will rather favor authoritarian rule. We saw that very, very clearly in the massacres in Egypt, for example, and the reinstallation of el-Sisi. And so one of the issues is this, that you have a moment where something unexpected and courageous has happened. And I thought it was very good for you to mention the shaheed, those who lost their lives, but also those who've been injured and who've been damaged in doing that. But at the same time, things have not necessarily settled. So we are talking about a situation which is a cusp, and we need to look at other places, including, for example, just what happened in Sri Lanka. We can see that the uprisings themselves do not produce new orders which are better than before or even improvement than before. That requires political work to be done. So my argument would be this, that if we start thinking a bit more openly about how we situate what is happening in Bangladesh, it will provide us with at least some kind of understanding of what things may be possible and improve our examples by which we can move forward. And that, I think, is an important part, and it's both an epistemological part as well as a political part.
Thank you. There are some important points we can take up later, especially on the point that whether, like, in what terms we can frame it as revolution, as kind of uprising, or something like revolution becoming. So now I will introduce Ustaz Usaama al-Azami, as I said. So Dr. Usaama al-Azami, he read his BA in Arabic and Islamic Studies at the University of Oxford, and his MA and PhD from Princeton University. He's also an alim who pursued Islamic studies in seminarial settings. He's primarily interested in Islamic intellectual history in relation with Islamic political thought. His first book, Islam and the Arab Revolutions, looks at the way in which influential Islamic scholars responded to the Arab uprisings of 2011 through to 2013. So his dissertation, entitled Modern Islamic Political Thought, Islamism in the Arab World from the late 20th to early 21st centuries. In it, he explores how Arab ulama of a mainstream Islamist orientation have engaged with Western political concepts such as democracy, secularism, and the nation state. So, and he has also a special identity. He's the grandson of the former Amir of Jamaat Islam in Bangladesh, Professor Ghulam Azam Rahimahullah. So I would ask you, you have sort of like a personal experience through your family connections, and also as a scholar of Islamism. What would be your reflection on the question of Islam and Islamism in Bangladesh after the July-August uprising?
Jazakumullah khair. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And really an honor to be in the company of very august scholars and people who I've known for many years now, except Naveeda, I got to know you fairly recently. So it's but still a great pleasure to sort of reconnect with so many old friends. And I wanted to perhaps start by pointing out, I mean, thank you for highlighting the fact that actually my qualifications are in Arabic and Islamic studies. And I was in a department which used to be called Oriental Studies up until a year and a half ago, I want to say. And I was teaching there until last year as well. And now I've actually, you know, my scholarly identity was largely as an intellectual historian. But that's by virtue of the fact that I was interested in Islamic studies as a student, and I couldn't do that in a South Asia department, for example. I couldn't really do that in a seriously rigorous way with acquiring Arabic skills unless I went to an area studies oriented, or as in my department, it was called Oriental Studies Department. And so I think, you know, some of those methodological problems that also go into the pedagogies that construct scholars in our various contexts reinforce all sorts of problematic presuppositions. So just reflecting on the critique of methodological nationalism, that's not an idea that I ever came across in my undergraduate training, or indeed, I don't think it was ever even mentioned in my postgraduate training, for that matter, in a department like Near Eastern Studies, because it was so normative, even though in sociology it's been talked about for decades at this point. And so, you know, that sort of framing of, you know, we also think about center periphery a lot increasingly in things like Islamic studies. So, you know, why is Islamic studies so Arab centric? Yet, you know, Islam as a phenomenon should, I think, fairly be seen as a global phenomenon with scholarship and input coming from everywhere in the world. Arabic is, I think, you know, in all fairness, should be a lingua franca for a tradition whose base texts are grounded in Arabic, but there isn't any reason to privilege sort of geographically Arab knowledge on Islam over other sort of centers for potential centers, and sometimes very major centers like South Asia or Southeast Asia, and perhaps increasingly Europe as well. So I think I just wanted to highlight that I'm not a South Asianist in strict terms, and my connections do come to this through a more personal route than perhaps most of my colleagues here. My grandfather was, of course, a victim of the previous regime, the dictatorial regime, and yet he has a connection, an intimate connection with the events of 1971. My uncle was released from Ainaghar in August, where he had been in solitary confinement, and, you know, was completely cut off from the world after 8 years. My close friend and classmate from my secondary school, Arman, also known as Mir Ahmed bin Qasim, was a lawyer who was also imprisoned there for 8 years. So those sorts of connections make it somewhat more personal. But I think my own work, even the stuff that before I came into, I'm actually in a theology faculty at the moment. And in some respects, that allows me to embrace both sides of my sort of intellectual personality, my seminarial training as a faqih and a mufti, and my training as an intellectual historian, I think. And I think the challenge that we face in both the academy and as we look out into the world is that bifurcation is sort of very aggressively imposed, and to a certain extent that sort of gulf is what we're attempting to bridge here. Political theology, which is a turn of phrase which I have a liking for, even though its genealogy has certain problems, shall we say, but it's a framework that is antithetical in some respects to the sort of secular norms and normativity of not just our modern polis and the modern political context, but also indeed much of the academy, even when it's trying to push back against, and this, I think, Professor Sayyid's work, Fundamental Fear, kind of teased this out of Edward Said's work as well. So in the context of Bangladesh, this is a very long-winded way of saying I find this a moment of great optimism to try and push back against these hegemonic norms, to try and open up an arena of conversation that allows for thinking about what does Islam look like in the context, and what does Islamic political theology look like, what does the Islamicate look like in the context of a society which is overwhelmingly Muslim, but has been laboring under, to use your phrase, Doha Bhai, Tanzeen Bhai, the necro-political secularist or Kemalist framework. And, I'd be interested to explore further the distinction between the good secularist and the bad secularist that you are sort of articulating. I, for a number of personal reasons over the last couple of months, I've not been able to follow very closely what's been going on in Bangladesh, unfortunately. But I hope to learn in the course of this conversation, and I hope to sort of reflect going forward, and inshallah travel in the near future. And my family is now welcome to travel back, although it never really affected my generation in a significant way, to Bangladesh to rediscover the possibilities of the Islamicate. And my only concern is that in a context of ideological hegemony, a kind of global secular liberal kind of hegemony, that and when I say secular liberal, I use these words with some hesitation because there are so many guises of this, but the same sort of secular liberalism that is, leading on a genocide on behalf of a Jewish state in Gaza right now is still part of that sort of global secular liberal hegemony. And so I would be interested in seeing what possibilities emerge in a context like Bangladesh. And I look forward to listening a lot more in the remaining of the discussion, inshallah.
Thank you. On that note, I'll just add maybe in our discussion, we can bring it up. There is a lot of discussion at this moment going on that we have to stand up against fascism. But I was having conversation with some of the friends that the genocide in Palestine is not happening under fascism, it's happening under liberalism. So whether we should equally criticize liberalism as well as an ideology. So, but before going to that, first of all, I forgot to mention Ustaz Usaama's current academic position. He's currently an assistant, assistant professor in Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam. And he has been teaching at Oxford for a couple of years before. So, but before going to all this discussion about Islam at the moment in Bangladesh, let's look back a bit in the historical context as well. As you know, that the question of 1971 and 47 is very much at the heart of all kind of political conversation in Bangladesh. And the kind of ideology that Bangladesh has been facing for the last, let's say, decade is based on this idea that Pakistan has been an Islamic state, which is at the same time communal, and which is not secular, and kind of oppressive to the minority communities, not to mention the seculars as well. So in that aspect, like, it is important to explore what the recent scholarship is talking about on the idea of Pakistan, how our panelists understand that, and what kind of understanding we can get to explore its various tendencies and implications in the current political context in Bangladesh. So my first question would be to Professor Salman Sayyid. You have an article on the meaning of Pakistan, which has been translated to our web portal. Anyone can check. It's available on our website. How do you frame the idea of Pakistan, and what would be your answer or analysis to the people who claim that Pakistan has been a failure? That is why we have to construct an ideology that is completely secular, and any association of Islam in the political sphere would contribute to a failed state like Pakistan.
These are three questions. I'll try and answer them succinctly as I can. Well, let's start with this one simple proposition. Let's say, as I think I mentioned in the article, West Pakistan left Pakistan before East Pakistan left Pakistan. And I think it's important to bear this in mind, because the idea of Pakistan as a project which was to articulate a notion of political identity, political belonging on the basis of Muslimness, was something that included both what was East Pakistan and West Pakistan. And in fact, if you look through the historical record, it is actually important to bear this, that it was not necessarily that the narrative that comes out normally emergences that Bangladesh emerged because it left Pakistan. But this was only rational because West Pakistan had already left the principles of Pakistan prior to that. For example, on the insistence of the language question, the reduction of the inappropriateness of the way that the distribution of resources, all of the things that we're talking about and we've known about in relation to how East Pakistan was treated could only be done so by the abandonment of the Pakistan project itself. So the question becomes more interesting, is that it's not, why was it that the Pakistan project was abandoned by West Pakistan prior to this? And I'm not even talking at the events of 1971, because we know there was events before that leading up to that history that you could argue that there was a failure to fulfill the mission of Pakistan. So the easiest answer people often put down to it is that they say, well, it failed because it was an Islamic state, and it shows that the failure of the Islamic state to do so. But if it had been an Islamic state, it would have privileged Muslimness over other kinds of considerations, for example, language, ethnicity, etc. It would have actually tried to transform itself into a state that wasn't based upon basically what I would call Kemalist and colonialist principles. And this was done in the period from 47 onwards. You could argue that basically at that moment when Pakistan passes the citizenship legislation in sort of 53 or 56, I can't remember right now, it actually stops becoming what its aspiration was, because at that moment it says even Muslims in South Asia can no longer migrate into what was Pakistan, etc. So there's a moment that you create a state which had never been created before, in which the argument was that it was your political belonging depended on your articulation and your ability to be Muslim and Muslimness. But once you have that, how to manifest that and how to practice that was undermined through a variety of really important factors. And as a result, you have a situation in which you break up the project of Pakistan prior to its breaking up of the country itself, in a way. And I think if we start thinking like that, it opens up different kinds of possibilities of understanding. But also, what it does is put the question that you've asked before about the idea of a failed state, and you need a secular state to work through this. Well, let me give you an example of a secular state. Syria is a secular state, and it's been completely devastated and destroyed. Iraq was under the Ba'ath, a secular state. It was completely devastated and destroyed. Everywhere where there's Muslim populations, where you've had Kemalist regimes, it has meant greater violence, almost violence of unimaginable proportions. And the violence is either physical and actual, but also transformational. So if you are in favor of the people or having a say in and having accountable governments in countries and among populations where a majority or many or a large number of people consider themselves or define themselves through Muslimness, you have to have a place for the Islam in there, because to exclude the Islamicate is also to exclude the voices of the people. You will not find authoritarian regimes which don't allow for the voice of the people by the fact that they have to exclude the Islamicate. So you can see this, for example, in the dictatorships that have emerged before and after in the Arab nationalism. Wherever you've had nationalism being articulated in these ways, you've actually produced a situation in which you have less freedoms except for a particular class, you have less accountable governments, etc. So I think it's important to see these things as not being fixed upon the narrative that produces the idea that secular governments are actually good. And let me just conclude with just one other comment. So one of the arguments made for secularism, a broader argument rather than an immediate argument, is that secularism leads to development. But let's take something like Sweden. Sweden has emerged as one of a country with the highest rate of literacy in the 18th, 19th centuries. It does so because of Bible classes. Religious education actually produces the condition that produces Swedish social democracy and the Swedish state. Now that tells you something. It means that the narrative that we have, that in a sense that secularism itself produces development, it produces advancement, it doesn't necessarily follow. It only follows by a Eurocentric understanding of previous histories in which are written from the point of view of the Enlightenment, which erase all of these other kinds of developments that we're talking about. So I think on both grounds, on the idea that the secular state itself will be successful, if you look at the immediate case, you can see that the secular state means a great deal of violence, and it means unaccountable government, and it has done so since 1924, and it will repeat that pattern. And also on a broader argument, that secularism is a necessary ingredient for social development doesn't stack up either when you look at the historical examples and you move away from the narratives of the European miracle.
Thank you. I can't resist to ask one question here, which you can add immediately, or you can after Professor Naveeda Khan, you can add, which is like, are you saying that the what happened in 1971 and before that is just a moral failure of Pakistan, and an ideal Islam would necessarily be successful in the short run or in the long run is because of the lack of certain, let's say, intellectual and moral orientation? The idea of Pakistan practically didn't work.
No, I'm actually saying something more specific than that. I'm actually saying that the project of Pakistan is not a necessarily moral failure. It probably, and I'm not sure the failure argument is actually particularly helpful in all of these arguments. What I'm saying to you is that there was a project called Pakistan, which had made a number of promises, and those attributes and those promises were not implemented. And I think it's worth exploring why they were not implemented. But what I'm actually saying is this, that they were not primarily implemented initially by West Pakistan. And therefore, I'm actually reversing the order that there was a Pakistan and Bangladesh broke away from it, is the argument. I'm saying actually West Pakistan broke away before East Pakistan broke away. And that probably explains a lot of the questions around is why the question of Islam is not important in a way, because it's not a question that Islam was not practiced. It was the governance of what a Pakistan would look like, what it should look like, was constantly undermined by a reversion to Kemalist logics. And I gave you one example around the Citizenship Act. If the Citizenship Act hadn't closed in 1953, if you didn't privilege that, or the language issue, there is no reason why you would have to have one national language. Or even if you wanted to have, why couldn't you have a bilingual state or a multilingual state, or say, look, there you don't need to have an official language, and the state infrastructure should make sure that wherever locality they are, they're able to communicate with their population. For example, the United States doesn't have an official language. So there's no need to have an official language per se. But the idea that you have to have one language, one ethnicity, etc., as defining what a state would be is not, what you're defining is a nation state. You're not defining an Islamic state. So that's what I'm saying, that the West, and then you can see the actual maneuvers around the 70 and 71, which basically reenacts that. I mean, to be very, very blunt about it, even at the most basic point, who won the election in 71? Who should have been able to form a government? End of story. Even at that basic level, that was a decision made by Bhutto, mainly Pakistani politicians who refused to acknowledge the victory, and then he becomes a Democrat as well. So that's, I mean, I'm asking both at a kind of a broader level, but also at a very mundane level to see the connections between this. The breakup of Pakistan was not necessarily inevitable in a way if West Pakistan hadn't actually opted out through its policies of the Pakistan project. And that isn't so simply that easy, because there were people who were arguing against this, contesting this, trying to work this out. So when, for example, Fatima Jinnah stands up against Ayub Khan, she gets tremendous support in what is now Bangladesh as well. So I think you have to we need to have a different genealogy and understand perhaps how these things came to be in the first place and look at the tensions involved in them, rather than this notion that it simply was something that was imposed from one side, and the East just basically realized that it wasn't working and left out of it. East Pakistan could not have been created without the support and actual sacrifices of people in what was East Bengal. They are the Pakistan project doesn't belong to either the West Wing or the East Wing. It was they were co-stakeholders in it. And I think this is something that has been erased and left out of the kind of narratives that we have that leads up to 1937 and 47, to the detriment of both countries, but more importantly, to the detriment of the people in both countries. So that's what I'm trying to say here.
Okay, thank you. Professor Naveeda Khan, I know you have your own thoughts on this topic. You describe Pakistan in your work as an experiment, as a state in the process of becoming. So can you please elaborate, like, what does the idea of Pakistan signify to you? And I know in one of your introduction, you have written about how the narrative of failed state has become a kind of discursive tradition or discursive academic narrative. So yeah, your thoughts, please.
Okay, actually, it's nice to follow up after Professor Sayyid, because in some ways I agree with his analysis, but at a different register. I strongly feel that the idea of Pakistan doesn't belong to either West Pakistan or East Pakistan, and that there was a strong investment in the idea on both sides. And so, to think that Bangladesh left Pakistan is kind of to tell the story incorrectly, which is that we must have an account in which we see a certain kind of prior failure that leads to Bangladesh leaving Pakistan, as opposed to Bangladesh checking out of the idea of Pakistan. So I think that's a very profound insight, and I wanted to underline that and appreciate it. I also, I guess, because I'm an anthropologist and I'm a little less interested in the workings of the state, or and state formation and its struggles, I was much more interested in how these realities are lived in a very ordinary way. And so I was very perplexed by the fact that people in the city of Lahore, where I did most of my field work, were so invested in building mosques, but then also fighting over mosques, right? And instead of seeing it in a pathological way, to see it as like sectarianism, failure of the state to provide clear guidelines on what it is to be a Muslim or Islam, in embedding myself in these neighborhoods and coming to know the people, I realized that there were other stakes as well in these fights, that they weren't necessarily only the way that they were being framed, sectarian fights, but that they were deeply held notions of, how one should commemorate the past, how one should think about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and so in some ways one had to give a more credence to how the theological had traction within the everyday life, as opposed to just think of it as Islamic ideology and its failure to fit with the everyday. And so that was a bit of my struggle in that book, is to say, what is a perspective by which we can look at all these struggles over in my context, looking at, mosque construction, but there could be other sites of examination as well, education, for example, welfare, and so on, that allows us to see still a working out of what is Islamic, or what is Muslim, or what is the right way to do things, or what is, a fair way, a just way to do things. And so that is what led me to actually think about Pakistan, not the nation state. Again, I didn't want to be confined just by the idea that the nation state provides the framework around my exploration, but that space, what kind of space of experimentation, and how it is even what is framed as failures of the state have been opportunities for certain kinds of existential explorations, theological questionings, practical arrangements by ordinary people. So I guess that is how I was thinking about becoming, which is the idea that I discuss in the book. And in terms of the state, I wasn't necessarily, advocating for an Islamic state or its obverse, secular state. I was trying to imagine what might a proper conversation look like in the style of a munazara, or what might a munazara between these, or is secularism just so oppressive that it doesn't allow for anything like a proper sort of, conversation. So I guess that is what I see as very exciting in the context of Bangladesh. It hasn't been burdened by the state mucking up Islam, or it has, but not to the extent that Pakistan has. And what might a proper conversation from the grounds up look like in terms of imagining arrangements, right? And what would it take to actually listen to that? These are all modalities that are not yet fully explored, I think. I mean, we can look to the past, but we can also try to imagine new arrangements that could be, I think, in the spirit of thinking of these as experiments of becoming and not just reproduction or repetition.
Baba, you want to jump in?
Can you repeat the question that you might have? There's so much content here, and
Yeah.
thanks to Professor
I mean,
Sayyid.
yeah, what basically we're exploring is the idea of 47 and 71, how these are all interconnected in the way the last regime has been constructing its own ideology around 71, as you know. So yeah, your thoughts on that?
I think the July uprising, one of the things that it brought back for us is the very important question that 47 has for contemporary Bangladesh. So the idea that Bangladesh conversation has to begin with 71, that is an exhausted idea. What we have, I will say one thing, because there's a lot of conversation right now about the constitution. And the Bangladeshi constitution is a record of secular failure, one after the other. It's literally a document that tells us how secularism fails in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of revisions. It's a report of that. So what is the challenge to the seculars in Bangladesh and the secularists in Bangladesh is to, instead of identifying their favorite enemies, every turn, every instance, and it happens to either be a Rajakar or a Jongi or a Shantrashi. If you're doing in war on terror, it's the terrorists. It's currently, there's a conversation about, oh, the extremists are going to come, et cetera, et cetera. These are all the kind of the psychic level, at the libidinal economic level. There is a serious, Doha, there's someone talking, and so it's, they need to be muted. I'm sorry. So I think it's Hussein Bhai who's taking care of the voice. So I just want to repeat that in Bangladesh, consistently, even right now, after this July uprising, there were two incidents. One was in the Pahari, in the Chittagong hill tracks, right? And there was immediately the national sort of civil society rhetoric was this alarmism about a kind of emergent Islamic extremism. So the word they started to use again was the same words that the past regime was using, the same kinds of utterances. And so we're seeing, and then there was a similar conversation about the puja activities. And we found out that Awami League regime actually hired people to disrupt it and then blame it on Islamism, etc. So why is a state continuously identifying enemies who carry the orientation of Islam? I'm going to repeat that because, again, someone else started speaking. Why is the secular state consistently identifying Islam as the enemy, the different variations of Islam? That's number one. So this is why I know we sarcastically talk about the good secularists, because they're the ones who now are talking about, oh, well, in 72, there was a constitutional shift to secularism. We're going to go to the 71 constitution, which is different from 72, because in 71, we use Shammu Manabik Morjada, human rights and equality, instead of secularism explicitly, etc. My question is, and one of the coordinators had mentioned that July 24 has to have the spirit of 71. My question is, so why is, again, the beginning point 71? And if we should talk about it, and I really liked the way Naveeda Khan had asked that what is sayable? What can we ask? This is a very important, what kinds of questions can we ask? So we can also ask the question then in Bangladesh, for a proper reconciliation, ultimately, there has to be a conversation about those who are spirited still by 47. That's not a dead question. 71 is a very important moment, and I think Professor Salman Sayyid really did an interesting counterintuitive move, which is to say that West Pakistan had left the Pakistan project prior to East Pakistan leaving. But the concept of Pakistan is a really significant concept for all the Muslims of South Asia, India included, Kashmiris included in many ways. So this is something that has to be discussed at that level. And under the current circumstances, and I think, Doha, I want to really address one quick thing, and then I'll let others speak, which is you brought up the question of how there was a framing of fascism with the Sheikh Hasina regime. I haven't used fascism that much, like Dr. Mahmoud Rahman does, and he does a really good job, and he's been standing up for it and sort of paying the price for saying things like that. And you said that, liberalism also is something that could be colonial and can perform these different tasks through a different register, but basically it also identifies Islam as sort of a problem. And I think we have to be, as those of us, and this is a scholarly point, not just a political, that we have to trace now how secularism is also transforming towards this kind of disciplinary domain instead of the necropolitical domain. We're, of course, very, very happy that Uncle Azmi is out of Ainaghar, that Arman is out of Ainaghar, that people are being released from certain, these are very concrete wins. But how is the state going to be formed? What is the grammar of we can only say things that the grammar would allow. We can only ask certain kinds of questions that the structure would allow. So these are things that we have to rethink. And in that rethinking, Pakistan is a very important question, political and intellectual question for us. It's not a question just about a state. It's a question of how can we allow a political imagination to begin. And I want to quickly end with something more concrete, which is that the Bangladeshi necropolitical regime, which we just gotten rid of, relied quite heavily on Indian intelligence and security apparatus. And this defeat was a defeat of that intelligence apparatus. The people have actually come forward to question the intervention of that apparatus. And so at this point, and then when I hear that there are certain kinds of friendly conversations happening at the diplomatic level with the Pakistan state in this new formation, that is an important sort of concrete and material question. We know that in 71, of course, There were all kinds of reasons, but there was a reason why India wanted to support the splitting of Pakistan. That's an important, concrete foreign affairs related reason, right? Not to deny all the oppression that took place under the Pakistani army, but the fact is that there is a geopolitical set of things that the people in Bangladesh will have to think about, and the state that's going to be formed must reflect the spirit of the movement that had gotten rid of this kind of necropolitical war on terror regime. And I'll end my comments there. Thank you.
Professor Salman Sayyid, you wanted to say something?
Just very, very quickly to pick up on a point that Professor Tanzeen made, which I think is worth mentioning and just builds on what he said. One of the things about the historiography of Pakistan is the idea that 1971 is a failure of the two-nation theory, which then acts as a failure of being able to build any consistent political project with a space of Muslimness in it. But in a way, you could actually argue 1971 is an endorsement of the two-nation theory. If it was going to be a failure of the two-nation theory, East Pakistan should have joined India. And the fact that it did not do so, the fact that it has never managed to do so, tells you that the Pakistan project actually exceeds its incarnations either in West Pakistan or in Bangladesh, but it still haunts those political dispensations, because there's something in that which led to the mobilization in 47 in the 30s to lead to the formation of Pakistan. And that promise and that mobilization is still relevant in both of those political constituencies. An attempt to erase that can only be done so with great violence and to undermining of the life chances and opportunities of the people contained in those countries. So I think it's just worth, again, not allowing ourselves to be twisted and in the kind of dominant ideological historiography, which sees 71 as a failure of two-nation theory, rather than actually, if it was a failure of the two-nation theory, we would have not have Bangladesh either. There'd be no East Pakistan, there'd be no Bangladesh. And I think that's really, really important to bear that in mind.
Okay, thank you. So in this part, I want to move on.
Can I just add something very quickly?
Yes, please.
Because I'm very curious about two registers and their possible collapse, and I'm curious to hear people's thoughts on it. One is, while I'm completely in agreement that the idea of Pakistan does not belong to West Pakistan, I'm not entirely sure that the current Pakistan that we have has bought back into the idea of Pakistan. At least by my own consideration, they're still checked out of the idea of Pakistan. And so I'm just curious what Bangladesh's overtures to Pakistan would be about now. I mean, I just feel like it's a distraction. I think that, Bangladesh has enough content and claims and history to, think this through without those terms. I mean, I do think that we do need to think about 47 to 71 much more seriously, and we can't occlude that history, but the structures of that remain with us, right? But I don't know what an overture to Pakistan means, because I feel we're so different and better. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not sure who's making the overture to Pakistan. I think it's important to distinguish two things here. One is the Pakistan project, which I think we all can agree on, had stakeholders from what is East Pakistan and West Pakistan and other places within the South, what was British India. So that I think one needs to understand. So the Pakistan project, which doesn't belong to a country called Pakistan at all, and the fact that it still continues to have some kind of element. And if you, for example, as you well know, among Hindutva circles, there's talk of little Pakistans, that areas of Muslim settlement in India are considered little Pakistans. So we don't only just have an East Pakistan, West Pakistan, United Pakistan, we also have the threat of little Pakistans. So let's be clear about that. There's a Pakistan project which is beyond the manifestation of any concrete element there. And a question about what Bangladesh needs to do, the only thing, and again, I'm sure they will do what they need to do, but the only thing I would point out is that the kind of ideological discourse which sees it as being formed in relation and opposition to the Pakistan project I don't think it actually stands. And if it does stand, it will lead to more and continuous repression for the reasons that I've already said. Now, that is separate than what kind of relations should happen if a Pakistan project is taken up by the ruling establishment in Pakistan again. And clearly, as we know, there's a huge tension around that, as many of those people who believe in Pakistan, the Pakistan project, are either in prison or not in power. And the ones who never believed in the Pakistan project have been ruling Pakistan for a very long time.
Thank you. Okay, so in this section, I want to move on to discuss the role of Islamism in the current political sphere in Bangladesh. So I will start with Ustaz Usaama, since you are a scholar of Islamism. So we are not only critiquing the idea of secular, etc. At the same time, there are critiques happening on the idea of Islamism itself. And one of the dominant critique has been is that the age of Islamism has come to an end. Now we are in an era of post-Islamism. It's kind of the way they look at the intellectual trajectory is similar with leftist political history. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Like,
Sure.
What's your idea about Islamism in the current, like not only in Bangladesh,
So,
maybe in the Arab world as well, and also, yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, this is something which I think my colleagues should speak to as well quite comfortably. But I mean, if I may just get back to a comment, Naveeda, you were talking about sort of overtures to Pakistan, and I think Tanzeen, you kind of alluded to this. And the way I see this is, you know, India has been so hegemonic in Bangladesh, in a sense, a signal to India that, you know, we're going to look for our own partners wherever they may be, as dysfunctional and as autocratic Pakistan is right now. And I hope Imran Khan is somehow, you know, liberated and able to sort of become a force for democratic transformation there. But I don't think the US will really stand for that at the moment. As you know, as repressive as it may be, India has been really the sort of dictator in our neighborhood. And so in some respects, I think, you know, I've been having conversations with colleagues who are not Bengali, but who are saying that, you know, the relations with India and China are particularly important. And I'm kind of thinking, well, these are both very problematic states in their own right, but, you know, that's international politics for you. You need to build partnerships in order to gain recognition and so on. They're the major players. With respect to Islamism, as I say, I mean, I would be very interested to hear my colleagues' thoughts on this as well. I always find these sort of appeals to post-Islamism, and when I teach this, there's always a week on post-Islamism as well. And Olivier Roy and I forget the scholar formerly at AUC, I think, I forget his name, which is really embarrassing, but brilliant sort of fascinating work on post-Islamism, as it were. And but I fundamentally disagree with this sort of discourse that, you know, Islamism was about trying to impose the Sharia, but post-Islamism is about human rights and, you know, and democratic accountability and so on. I think this is a framework or a framing that is, in some respects, programmatic, and I think it also reflects the adaptability of Islamic projects. I would say that in this sort of in the practice of what people call Islamism, and I know the term is quite contested, and you know, I respect the fact that, you know, it's been instrumentalized in the context of the global war on terror to label anyone who is you know, a threat to the current hegemonic order of the United States and its allies. But regardless of that, I think if any organization is described as post-Islamist in our own time, it might be, you know, the Tunisian project, where they've very self-consciously kind of gone down that path. And I don't think it's done them a great deal. It may have given them a few more years, but, you know, the sort of what Professor Sayyid calls the Kemalist project is not going to tolerate a whiff of Islam in the political sphere. And so I think that those are ultimately also going to come up against the quite compelling force of our scriptural tradition. It has certain imperatives which Yes, there's plenty of stuff which counts as religion in a Protestant context, Protestant sort of post-Enlightenment conception, but there's so much that goes beyond that into the political sphere that is just suppressed by that conception of religion that is so hegemonic in our own context. And I think Islamism is a rebellion against that, and a kind of effort to give ourselves an independent voice, free from those sorts of secular and ultimately colonial impositions. As much as plenty of people, including plenty of Muslims and elites in our own societies, have internalized these kind of secular norms, these post-colonial norms, and they live and breathe it. They are true believers in the secularist project. But that doesn't give them the right to shut us in sort of prisons and execute us en masse, as has been the sort of I think the modus operandi of the global war on terror, and which the Army League government has learned very well, or the past Army League government. So I think in that context, I don't live under the sort of fantasy that we can actually freely now think as people who are trying to reimagine Islamic political theology without being under this kind of hegemonic umbrella, much of which is epistemic hegemony as well. But I do think that this does open up possibilities, and I really enjoy listening to my colleagues when they think in these imaginative ways to push against the sort of existing frameworks. I hope that gives something of a response.
Yeah, I will add some sub questions to that. Maybe I will come back to you at the end again, which is some of the discussion is like, why can't we follow the path of Rashid Ghanouchi or people like Erdogan, who are, you can say, Islamist or Islamicate in some sense?
Rashid Ghanouchi is in jail. He's
Yes,
an 84-year-old man in jail who
Yeah.
tried to do everything they thought was the opposite of what the Brotherhood did in Egypt, and they still ended up in jail. So maybe that should be one argument if people say, why we can't be like Rashid Ghanouchi, because it doesn't make any difference to the fact that Tunisia, as Usaama said, that they tried to do very, very explicitly, if the Brotherhood does X, we will do Y, everywhere, all along the line, and they still ended up in jail. So maybe that might be a reason.
Okay. So, and the second part of my sub question would be, so when we talk about Islamist party, like I'm talking about like concrete reality in the ground in Bangladesh, like maybe in Pakistan as well. Like naturally the images come, they want to establish Sharia, they want Khilafah, they want an Islamic state. So my question to you, all of you, would be like, what kind of reflection of Islam we want at this critical juncture in Bangladesh? Are we really talking about having Sharia? Are we trying to make it an Islamic state, or like idea of Pakistan whatsoever? Can Islam give or contribute something more than that instead of just some kind of legalism? But before that, I can go back to Professor Salman Sayyid, because I know you're very interested on the question of Islamism and your upcoming book, when it will be published. We'd like to know.
That's the most difficult question you've asked me all day. Inshallah soon. I mean, to be honest with you, it's more my fault than anyone else's fault, and I've run out of excuses, so I have to finish it very, very quickly. Hopefully, inshallah, next year.
Bitawfiq, inshallah. Can I just throw in, I mean, I know I've just spoken, but I'll just be very brief. Like, I always get frustrated when people say that, is this going to be the imposition of the Sharia? And my response is, well, what is the Sharia, right? The Quran says, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. Enact or have taqwa of Allah to the extent that you're able to. So the question of trying to re-enliven an Islamic imaginary in society is part of what the Sharia is, as far as I'm concerned. And that can be a gradualist approach. It may require, having a situation where society as a whole continues to live basically in under the secular norms that they've been living under for so long. And we start basically having discourses where we open up the possibility of alternative visions. For me, that is, if that's, you know, as far as we can go, that is the Sharia. And there are plenty of scholars in the Arab world that I'm familiar with, including quote unquote Islamists, who say that, well, if someone wants to impose the hudud tomorrow, I will be the first to object, because the hudud is not something that you're supposed to sort of make a primary objective in the Sharia. In fact, the Sharia itself says, try and avoid applying the hudud punishments with by drawing on the benefit of doubt. And so, you know, just the sort of fetishization in a secularist discourse as a kind of mechanism for demonizing the Sharia is not, is unfortunately like quite a normative understanding of the Sharia. In, you know, a lot of Hollywood is a powerful tool. Like one thinks back at just the sheer number of Hollywood films that demonize Sharia, and I'm sure Bollywood does this far more effectively in South Asia. So yeah, I think, you know, people need to chill out a lot more when they start talking about Sharia. It's nothing terrifying. Being loving and caring in the way in which you bring society back to Islam is the Sharia. That's
But
part of the
also,
process.
but I would just add to this,
And
because
of
I mean,
course
I'm
also has
sure,
more rigorous elements.
yeah, but Sharia already exists in Bangladesh. I mean, how people bury their dead. I mean,
Right.
how you say your prayers. I mean, all of these things are not, I mean, if they already, are you saying, or are people saying that people should not bury their dead facing Mecca? They should not wash their dead, etc. I mean, it's
Right,
just, I think part of it is this kind of Islamophobic discourse, which is inherent in Kemalism, which defines Sharia in these very, very narrow tapes and forgets the fact that Muslim, as you've said, there is not the question, there is absence of Sharia. It's just a question about how it's worked through. And that, I think, is for a community to decide upon itself and how it determines that. And there will, of course, be opposition to different articulations and things. But we should not assume that this is the absence of Sharia in Muslim life throughout the planet.
Can I also, forgive me, I've been going, I'll see
Yeah,
one last
sure.
point, which is that, you know, Ali ibn Abi Talib did not punish the killers of Uthman. This is a well-known fact. And this is discussed in the books of like fiqh and tafsir, that it's permitted to suspend the application of the hudud. I mean, these people, or in this case, it would be in qisas, I suppose. It's permissible to suspend these things in contexts which call for that on the part of, you know, a legitimate ruler can make that judgment call. And so, you know, these sorts of things which are, you know, just stereotypically raised in this sort of context as absolutely unconditional. It's more about the sort of secular imaginary of religion rather than what the religion itself says, which is not an excuse to say, oh, let's just suspend everything and nothing else matters, and we're just going to realize a sort of secular worldview and call it Sharia. That's not what we're advocating either, but there should be a genuine engagement that is organic with the tradition, in my view. Anyway, sorry, I'll stop there.
Can I simply add one small point about this question of law? Doha, is it okay?
Can I come back to you, because initially I asked a question to Professor Salman Sayyid, and I will come back to you. Professor Salman Sayyid, like, I would like to have your reflection on the question of Islamism. Like, what did you see its contribution in the current political sphere?
I'm happy to concede my position to Tanzeen, which has a brother here, because I think I've already spoken, but I'm happy to come back to the question. But if then you want to say something on a small point and keep it rather than
no, I
to
will put a couple of questions together for Brother Tanzeen.
All
That's
right.
why.
All right. I don't want to usurp your control over the meeting either. So okay, I'll answer. Look, I think we need to understand Islamism not as a political logic, rather than as a specific set of ideologies or specific organizations, etc. And therefore, I think one way to think about Islamism would be the argument that Muslimness should have a space in the public sphere. It should be able to articulate and construct different kinds of sense of belongings. One of the things that I saw on television, you know, and I don't know how frequent it was, is, for example, in many of the demonstrations against the regime in Bangladesh, they were flying Palestinian flags. Now, that itself tells me something really, really important. It tells me that the consciousness of the people has been raised So it goes beyond their very kind of immediate circumstances, and they're making these kind of grander arguments about what is right and what is wrong. So part of the role of Islamism is to rethink the supremacy of ethno-nationalism, which is ultimately a racial logic, and to challenge that. And where it challenges that consistently, it has been far more successful than where it succumbs to that or accommodates that. So I think part of that is to construct a different kind of political arrangement, which doesn't reproduce the liberal colonial racial logics that we've inherited and subsumed that, and opens up a better way of living for everyone. Now, how that is done is a matter of actual detail and matter of actual conversation in the situations that people are involved in. But certainly it's the orientation for that should be towards this. That is something that we need to transcend. What we've seen in Gaza, and I think it's important to remember that we're talking at this moment about this brutal genocide, which has been enabled and facilitated by states which consider to themselves to be and told everyone that they're liberal and democratic for decades. And they're overseeing this, and they're implicated in this. And what is happening is this, the abandonment of nearly every single convention that was considered to be part of the normative international order around genocide, about human rights, cruelty, etc. So in a way, we no longer have on this planet anyone who's willing to speak for human decency. And perhaps this is the opportunity for Islamicists to reclaim that within that, to argue for human decency, for the decency of actually being able to govern ourselves and to govern through our own traditions, but at the same time to extend that hospitality to others. So that means recovering the idea of the Islamicate as being something which was always much more plural than the Orientalist caricatures make of it. And one example that I use in just to illustrate that in one of the chapters in Islamism is philosophy, which is this, that look, England and Iraq, England became continuously Christian at the same time as Iraq became continuously Muslim. There are no pre-Christian groups left in England. The only people who came was after the 20th century, early 19th century. Whereas in Iraq, which had been under Muslim rule for the same amount of time England was under Christian rule, there were many, many pre-Islamic communities which existed and were viable and sustainable. So this idea that Islam is not tolerance or if this is completely false. And we need to understand that Islamism is about pluralism and a plural orientation, which is necessary of the world. And I think in Bangladesh, that means a society which is just, a society that believes in distribution, a society that believes in tempering the excesses and hardships that many people face, and that thinks beyond its own narrow sectorial or ethno-racial boundaries.
So, Tanzeen, I will come back to you on a couple of things together. So one is, if you can briefly touch on, when you talk about Islamism, if you can briefly touch on the Shapla massacre, and also, which I think is not mentioned almost at all, the massacre of 22 madrasa students when the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to Bangladesh in 2020. So, if you connect all this to discuss the prospect and contribution of Islamism in the current political environment, and the second thing is if you can make a connection with the idea of tradition, because when we are talking about the notion of Islam in Bangladesh, there are also kind of discussions going on. What kind of Islam are we talking here? Why political Islam should be the only manifestation of Islamic tradition? Yeah, I'll just leave you on that.
Thank you for those questions. Those are, again, very, very difficult questions. I would like to simply make one comment about some of the earlier things that Usaama was covering, which was about this phobia that the secularists have about the Sharia, about Islamic jurisprudence and law, and this kind of imagination that they have of a sinister legal structure that's going to just limit them so much, and et cetera, et cetera. I think Bangladeshis understand very clearly what the secular law at the state level can do. We're not talking about just the extrajudicial killings. We're talking about a whole tribunal, judicial killings systematically done to people without following any international standards, but saying that they're doing entirely, the entire thing was done through a legal juridical structure. So no one there's no comparison of Islamic legal violence, the way that the Bangladeshi state in the last regime orchestrated very systematically on political opponents and hanged them through a judicial process, in quotations. So if there is any worry of a law, a legal structure dominating us, this 2024 was also a struggle against a kind of manipulation of a legal system that to repress and kill of people, and then calling them and tagging them as Islamists, even when some of them weren't, and some of them were, right? So we had a very fake war crimes tribunal process through which many leadership level leaders were killed. These are concrete things that matter to us. So all the phobia about the Sharia and all, we have to focus on really, in a delicate way, the secular legal structure having this kind of impact on the people and the lives of Bangladeshis. That's number one. And your question about Islamism and the Shapla killings, and I think it's very, very important that in 2013, there are different estimates that people think that 1 million people showed up, and most of them was the Tawhidi Janata, right? The ulama and the Islamic practitioners have organized under, in quotations, a political umbrella of Hifazat-e-Islam, and many other Islamic tendencies were there. In other words, all the Qawmi madrasas of the country organized under a banner to protect the honor and the image of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam against a very particular kinds of pornographic depictions of him in various blogs and so on. And that protest created a panic in the regime. And in May of 2013, there were massacres and killings. And a lot of it is very hard to investigate, even as anthropologists, because people weren't allowed to stay, including opposition media, who weren't necessarily Islamist. So we know from the things that are written by survivors, and even the human rights based groups were censored by the regime, so they couldn't keep a record of anything. And they had to actually operate from outside of the country. We know what happened to Odhikar at the time when they created a report of the killings that took place. Now, the Shapla protest was really significant in the Bangladeshi context is because prior to that, Islamism was always directly linked only to one party, which is Jamaat-e-Islam. And the public discourse, particularly the secular nationalist discourse, was that Jamaat-e-Islam was against the 71, blah, 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 and therefore these are the enemies of the state. But in 2013, the struggle to protect the honor of the Prophet was led by simply the ulama, the Islamic scholars, and the students and madrasa students who were there. So we had a public protest, the largest in the country at that point, that came with Islamic garb and Islamic orientation, and chanted for the protection of the honor of the Prophet, and asked the same legal system that at least creates some kind of laws, some kind of system to make sure that our sensibility, Islamic sensibility, is not harmed and violated. So this is why this was a very important moment, because in Bangladesh, for the first time, we saw an Islamic movement that was not explicitly political by the level of organization and so on, but also it gotten out of the rubric of Jamaat-e-Islami, even though we do know that all the Islamic tendencies actually showed up to protest this kind of violation of the honor of the Prophet. So I think in that sense, it was a very important moment. Now, the second part was the way that the Bangladeshi regime with that same apparatus, the security and intelligence apparatus, which is inherited from the war on terror logic, supported ideologically quite a bit by the Indian state, etc., how they actually orchestrated the violence. So it was that's why we use the secular necropolitical framing in some of our local discourses, because it's a politics of death dealing. It's the politics of how to distribute death, how to inflict pain, how to engage in various kinds of torture, interrogative measures, etc. So this is precisely why the question of Islam is actually a question of calling into question the logic of violence that is organized by a particular kind of secular technique and mechanism. So this is very, very important for those of us who are historians or anthropologists to pay attention to. And, I had the luck to have access to some of the written works of survivors, some of the poems that they've written about what had happened in the Shapla massacre, and was able to have conversations. It was very difficult because of the way intelligence and DGFI office member and all of these people were following, even researchers. So it was very difficult to do certain kinds of work. And I hope that we can continue to the work to do the research, because that's something that the regime, of course, they celebrated in the Bengali language, but when it came to international news and the way they've portrayed the regime, basically denied that they've done these killings, because they were able to do it in the dark, so to speak. And in my research, I sort of talk about what it means to think about dead time, for example, with the Shapla massacre. It happened in a time when the time itself had vanished. So it was hard to register it in a proper kind of just a chronological history or empirical kind of history of things. So there has to be, I must say that the new interim government should definitely create a commission, a committee, something to deal with the Shapla massacre in a very, very rigorous way, so scholars can actually put the data together to create an archive and complete the archive. So we have that as a record of what had taken place in Bangladesh. That's number one. And the anti-Modi protests in 2020 was a return of that same logic. We know that when Modi came to Bangladesh, the Islamic-oriented, the ulama again, and many others have opposed his arrival to the country. And the regime, again, the intelligence apparatus, the security apparatus, was extremely violent, and many people were martyred. And we know from in Chittagong in particular that with Mufti Harun Izhar, who did a tremendous work of protecting some of those madrasa students and trying to protect the Islamic-oriented, the students who were just seminary students. And there has to be, that's probably going to be in the epilogue of my book, as to this kind of anti-Modi protest that had happened, and how the question was returned, the Shapla question. I do want to quickly, I know I'm taking up a little bit too much time, and you asked me about the question of tradition. What does tradition mean? And we know from Talal Asad's 86 essay, everyone is familiar with that, the idea of this looking at Islam as a discursive tradition. And I think the idea is to stop thinking about Islam as just simply religion, because religion itself is a secular category, and it gives us certain kinds of limits, and we're allowed to say certain kinds of things when we think of Islam as religion. But when we think of Islam as the potential order of things, something that would actually remove the transcendent mediating role of secularism itself, and is challenging secularism at its core. And at that point, we do have to think about the rich tradition that we have, which has all of these contestations and disputations within it. So in each particular context, Islam could be properly assessed and understood, and it could play a very important role in the construction of a new kind of society and a new kind of state. So I think this is why the question of tradition is important. The other thing about discourse is that discourse has its limits, which means that it cannot just take anything and everything. And this is precisely why it's not that every that there are too many kinds of Islams, right? This is not a kind of naive relativism, but rather a discourse has the emergence of a particular kinds of orthodoxy from within itself, sort of an authoritative discourses emerge. And that's where the question of power is really interestingly dealt with by Talal Assad's work. And I think that is something that is really significant for us. And those of us who are in anthropology, have been quite a bit influenced, even when we may have some disagreements with the Assadian framework. But I think what it allows us is to fight against the secular meta-narrative against Islam as religion and reducing it to religion. And we must resist that just as thinkers. Politically, whatever you want to think, we have to have an intellectual conversation that's actually honest and sincere. And so when we're thinking about tradition, we have a different set of resources that we can tap into, that we can access in thinking about the construction of the state and a new society. I'll end there, and inshallah, I can answer other questions and engage with others.
Okay, we are running out of time, so we will end our discussion and move on to Q&A after asking the last question to Professor Naveeda Khan. So I can sense like the kind of conversation you are having with Professor Salman Sayyid, that why Bangladesh can't have its own kind of an aspiration and model, an idea about how Islam should be represented in the political sphere. So yeah, I would like to know, like, what would be your understanding of the representation of Islam at the political sphere, whether in law, constitution, whatsoever. With that, we will finish and move on to Q&A session. You are muted. Oh, okay.
Yes, I just started. Sorry. Thank you for those questions. And, really, truly wonderful to hear all these different perspectives. And I'm very much moved by, Professor Doha's work. Brokenheartedness was really, really a very, very compelling, piece, which made me think about how important something like, I don't know if it's possible, but something like a truth and reconciliation process within Bangladesh, in which, these trauma, I mean, they're not anything less. These traumas are talked about, and we discuss how it is that we move past them and so on. I mean, again, I can only bring in the context of Pakistan, and as I studied it, it's a country that I find fascinating. There's lots and lots to learn from it. And, I've spent a large part of my life trying to look at that history through the lens of plenitude as opposed to lack, right? But there are certain things that have struck me in the way in which the state takes up what is a tendency within the populace and privileges it over others that is that is productive of violence, whether we're talking about secularist tendencies or we're talking about, more Islamic tendencies. So, for instance, the way in which the government in Pakistan has mobilized a blasphemy law, right? And the way that it operates, the feedback loop into the everyday, has been to not so much be protective of the legacies of our Prophet, but really to do a lot of interpersonal violence within small contexts, right? That then get a certain kind of wider resonance. And then, the question, I mean, one of the tough things in Pakistan has been the question of the Ahmadis, right? And it's something that I think we need to actually also address head on. Like, there is a picture of Islam that I can completely abide by, which is the one that Professor Usaama put forward, which is, something in progress, something through conversation, something that we're already doing as part of our lives, that's orienting us to transvalue it and so on, and to think of the Sharia in that way. But the fact of the matter is that Islam is a proselytizing religion, and that gives it a certain energy and intensity. And Ahmadis, as an offset of that, are also very proselytizing. So what do we do with the question of proselytization, right? I think these are challenges and that we have to face them. So in the same way that I'm completely completely sympathetic to a radical critique of the secular state and the way that it marshals and organizes violence and produces differences between different kinds of deaths, right? I also feel that we need, need some attention to certain energetics, certain orientations, certain tendencies that need just more open address, I think. So maybe I'll just stop there.
Okay. Ustaz Usaama, do you have anything to share?
Can I just kind of reflect on what you've
Yeah.
mentioned, Naveeda, which is fascinating and sort of course, these are also well-worn areas of concern. And you mentioned, Islam as a proselytizing creed or proselytizing faith. And I'm reminded of Charles Taylor's wonderful phrase in his with Amy Gutas is her name, in that edited volume from 1994, where he says liberalism is a fighting creed, right? And that's very true as well. I mean, we see that in the global order. So I think, any tradition, in order to create these sort of global projects, which, exponents of those traditions will see them as projects for good, but I think liberalism has been, very much an accompaniment of the state, and particularly the liberal colonial projects have been, projects of mass genocide on an epic scale. One thinks of just, the book, I forget by which, the name of the historian, David something, but American Holocaust, or a whole host of other works that explore these sorts of questions. And I think, from the Muslim perspective, when it comes to something like Ahmadism, I think the analogies are really readily available from the liberal/secular context as well, particularly with respect to the way in which, the killing of Yahya Sinwar and the way in which we can respond to that is policed, right? Asa Stanley of the Electronic Intifada, who's a white journalist based in the UK, for an organization which is, based in a country which has a Bill of Rights, of course, and free speech, has been arrested under the Terrorism Act. He's white. I mean, like, those of us who are Muslim, we know we can't say anything like what he gets away with. And so that sort of disciplining, I think, is far more violent. My colleague who just wrote a book called The Imam and the Caliph, it's an enormous book, about 900 pages, about the history of Sunni and Shia Islam. But the reality is most of that history has been one of fairly benign mutual sort of like recognition. And that's been the norm within Islamic history. Groups like Ahmadis, a lot more heretical groups than the Ahmadis, were tolerated in Islamicate societies. Why did the Yazidis exist in sort of Iraq to be genocided by ISIS? And so I don't think historically Islam has had any problem with managing that sort of difference, but it has become an issue in the shadow of the modern state. And we do need to avoid importing the pathologies of the modern state into our project. I agree with that.
With that note, we can end the discussion and move to Q&A. So I have, like, in total, it seems 10 questions. How about I kind of read the summary of the question of like 5, and whoever wants to respond can respond. Is it good? Okay, so one question specifically to Professor Sayyid, but anyone can respond. What do you think about the Faisal Dabji's Muslim Zion? Could you share your thought on minority as a political form? And the question is a general question about the good literature on constitution and it's being a record of secular failure. Third question is from my professor from Malaysia, Professor Abdullah Al-Ahsan. What do you think about the future of the nation-state system? Fourth question is from Fuad Ali. It's a bit long. So David Miller, sociologist who has worked on Islamophobia, has excavated the term Islamism as coming from a Zionist epistemic political agenda. It makes project quite vulnerable. Does this observation have any bearing whatever on your scholarly, social, and political work to Tanzeen Bhai. Rizwanul Islam to Ustad Usaama. I'm not sure if you were aware of the essence of Islamism in Bangladesh, but a significant portion of it derives inspiration from a narrow and anti-usuli sources that even the mainstream Islamists would disavow, that poses a threat to the dynamic project mainstream Islamists aspire to actualize. How would you evaluate the reality? Yeah, so with this 5, we can start the Q&A, and then I will try to finish the rest of the question. Professor Salman Sayyid can go on first.
I think the best way to do and save time is if I can put down the link on a blog, recent blog about Pakistan's anti-Zionism, which may actually has something to say about DevG's Muslim Zion project. That might be the easiest way to respond to that, I think, and it allows more time for others.
Okay. In my screen, I see Ustaz Usaama first, so I'll go with that.
Okay, could you sort of give me a bit of a sense of like what he means by, or she means by usuli?
I'm not sure what he actually meant, but it's about a significant portion of Islamism, essence of Islamism in Bangladesh is derived from inspiration from a narrow anti-usuli sources that even mainstream Islamists would disavow. Yeah,
I'm
I don't
not
know.
entirely sure what that means. I mean, all I would say is that this is a comment I sometimes make in the modern the formations of the modern state, or as a formation, we in current sort of democratic practices in a place like the West, for example, people there's a division of labor which we don't have the luxury of within Islamist movements very often. So, you know, the Labour Party or the Conservative Party is a political party. It doesn't aspire to produce intellectuals. It doesn't aspire to create social movements on the ground that are going to produce, you know, welfare services, hospitals, maybe newspapers occasionally, etc. And you know, a sort of discursive context that is trying to create an alternative to the often secularist and unwelcoming sort of forms of governance that exist, or governmentality that exist in Muslim society. So in that sort of a context, I think actual existing you know, self-designating Islamist organizations will have all sorts of deficiencies which are sometimes just a natural function of the limited access to resources that they have. But I don't think that is what Islamism is. Islamism is a far broader imaginary that this is a small component of. And sometimes some of these groups will say, you know, we're the true Islamists, or may think of themselves as that way. But I think that's kind of par for the course for human beings. They really think, you know, as a famous example is in the various disciplines of the Sharia, every sub-discipline, the scholars of that discipline said, you know, this is the most important discipline in the Sharia. That's fine. I mean, people can have those sorts of feelings about what they do. People only dedicate themselves to what they consider to be important. But the whole picture is necessary for, I think, a proper, viable Islamist project. I hope that, you know, it gives a bit of an answer.
Well, as Salman said, do you want to respond to this question about the future of the nation-state system?
I think the future of the nation-state system is limited. It doesn't really exist anywhere. And what we've seen in Gaza and the onslaught on Palestine is that the nation-state doesn't have the resources on its own to resist global Islamophobia. And what would have to see a pooling of sovereignties in different mechanisms to allow a Muslim representative voice to exist in the global order and to resist global Islamophobia.
Professor Naveeda Khan, do you like to share your thoughts on? So you are muted.
Sorry, which of the questions would you like me to? Because there was quite a lot of them. So
exactly, yeah, you can have your thoughts on nation state as well, like if you are
on the
interested.
nation state. I really think I would have to agree with Professor Sayyid that, you know, the nation state has shown itself to be completely weak in the face of the attack on, you know, on innocent lives in Gaza, and in fact has shown itself to be morally bankrupt, if anything else, in the face of it. You know, a very narrow bandwidth of interests have been at play. It's shocking how, you know, nation states have responded to what is going on there. And, you know, I'm not sure if that augurs its demise, but certainly it indicates that we need a different way to think about sovereignty, and a different way to think of it through an assemblage form in order to attend to such attacks. So.
Tanzeen Dohabai, like, you have a particular question which is about this Islamism coming from a Zionist epistemic political agenda. Your thoughts on that, and maybe anyone, including Tanzeen Bhai, can respond to. I'm adding another question. He wrote in Bangla, like the relationship between Islamism and Muslim nationalism, the kind of relationship and the kind of conflict it may have. Yeah. With that, we will end.
I actually still, maybe there's a typo. I don't know how the person who's asking the question is making a connection between Islamism having a similar emergence as Zionism. Maybe they're referring to Faisal Devji's argument. I just think that's not a very good argument to think about Islamism as in any way, shape, or form having this kind of connection with or similarity with Zionism. Zionism is a very specific kind of secular history, has its own genealogy, and maybe they're thinking simply that from Judaism, there's a particular interpretive community who came up with Zionism as a response, et cetera, et cetera. So Islam must be, it's totally different genealogy. When we're thinking about Islamism, I like Salman Sayyid's, fundamental fear, where he's talking about the second crisis, which is the abolition of the Khilafah. And from there, the emergence of a particular kind of articulations that basically resulted in various forms of Islamism and the project of a future that would think through questions that are important and significant for a large majority of Muslim populations and societies. And so I don't think of them as having any kind of similarity. And also, a settler colonial logic is in no way could ever be compared to a kind of political history that was in response to the violence of the modern state form. Islamism essentially is a response to the violence of the modern state as a form, and thinking about how we can have lives that are meaningful, in which Islam plays a significant role. And I think that's a very different question and very different genealogy, et cetera, et cetera. I think you had another question. I don't know.
Yeah, if you're interested, you can answer on that. The relationship and the kind of conflict may have with Muslim nationalism and Islamism. You and Professor Salman Said, and with that we will end. I am trying to commit to my words, which has been 2 hours now. Yeah.
I think Professor Said should answer that. I do have certain things to say, but I think it would be best if Professor Said answers.
Oh, you say it first. I don't mind.
Well, in the context of Bangladesh, there is a debate between, I would say, Muslim nationalists. There's a tendency of that, and Islamism. I've always thought of Islamism as sort of an ethical, legal kind of political project that calls into question secular power. Muslim nationalism seems to be based more on thinking about the question of nationalism, but trying to make it Islamic, etc. A kind of logic of heritage. So very different. To me, that seems to have a different connotation, even though there are overlaps between the two. And I think within the Bangladeshi, the Sultanate, the whole debate about that, and the heritage that comes with how Islam came to the subcontinent, there's also a cultural kind of interest in Islamic heritage and all that. basically comes from Shahab Ahmed's work, in my view, to an extent, and kind of rereading that within a nationalist framing, and then trying to say, well, not Bengali nationalism, but a Muslim nationalism. I kind of don't see how, or the proponents of this thing are not really properly articulating something coherent for me. And so I find Islamism to have a different kind of like a more coherent like history or a genealogy, right? Which to me are not the same things. It doesn't emphasize a kind of racial understanding of Muslimness in any way. It's kind of an ethical order. It does have a legal connotation, etc. And so I think those are two different things, and there are overlaps, and I think conversion is possible.
Well, Salman,
I agree entirely. I agree entirely with what's just been said with Tanzeen. I think it's really, really important to distinguish the two. The way I would put it is this, that Muslim nationalism is another variant of Kemalism. Ultimately, it's a bit like people who argue that the reason why Muslims don't eat pork is because it's bad for your health. It seems to be an endorsement of science, but actually what it does is make the divine secondary to human endeavor. Similarly, nationalism tries to make it's kind of like decaffeinated Kemalism, because really the point about Islamism is to create a Muslim subject or to articulate Muslimness, which doesn't have ethnic and national connotations, or shouldn't have ethnic and national connotations. And when it does have those kind of ethno-nationalist terms there, they are problematic because they refer back to a racial logic. So if Islamism means anything, it means that the question about Muslimness transcends notions of nationalism in the way that it's normally conceived around that. That doesn't mean that people don't have different languages, different cuisines, different cultures, different histories, etc. The question is what is meaningful about them. We don't construct a overarching sensibility by erasing all differences, but nor do we say that those differences in themselves stand on their own. A Muslim nation, what would be a Muslim nation that excluded other Muslims?
Thank you. With that, we will end our panel discussion. I'm really grateful to all the participants and the panelists. Please stay tuned with shanshan.com. And there have been, I know, lots of topics and debates came up we couldn't explore fully, but individually, maybe with all the speakers, we will continue to have this kind of conversation in future. And I look forward to meet some of you in Istanbul. Especially Brother Salman Sayyid with your new book. With that, we will end.
No pressure, huh? Okay, thank you. It was a great talk.